People misunderstand money because they focus on amounts instead of effects. They ask how much they need, as if there's a finish line where life suddenly changes. That's not how it works. Most amounts do very little. Then, at certain thresholds, something shifts. Not externally, internally. $20,000 is not a large sum. It does not buy freedom. It does not buy status. It does not buy safety for very long. But it does something far more important. It changes how decisions get made. Before that point, nearly every financial decision is defensive. You're reacting. You're managing shortages. You're trying not to fall behind. That condition shapes behavior more than people like to admit. It narrows thinking. It encourages short-term fixes. It makes bad trade-offs feel reasonable. People like to say that money doesn't change anything. That's nonsense. Lack of money certainly does. When you're operating without any buffer, you don't choose the best option. You choose the option that keeps you alive another month. Over time, that kind of thinking becomes habitual. Even when opportunities appear, the mind trained in scarcity struggles to recognize them. The first meaningful amount of money doesn't solve problems. It removes panic. And that's a profound change. At around $20,000, for the first time, many people experience financial slack, not abundance. Slack, a small margin for error, a brief pause between cause and consequence. That pause is where rational thought begins to function properly. This is why the number matters. Even though the number itself is arbitrary, the effect is what counts. It's the point where every mistake is no longer fatal, where every decision doesn't need to produce immediate relief, where time starts to re-enter the equation. Most people never reach this point because they treat money emotionally. They spend to relieve stress. They chase returns to escape boredom. They confuse activity with progress. By the time they accumulate anything meaningful, they've already trained themselves to misuse it. That's why this amount is dangerous as well as useful. It gives people confidence before it gives them discipline. Some use it to build a foundation. Others use it to confirm their worst habits. What changes after $20,000 is not your lifestyle. It's your incentives. It's your patience. It's your tolerance for waiting instead of reacting. If you understand that, this amount becomes a tool. If you don't, it disappears quietly. I'm not going to talk about tactics or shortcuts. I'm going to explain what actually shifts at this threshold and why it matters far more than people think. Each change is subtle. None of them are dramatic. Together, they explain why some people finally begin moving forward while others remain stuck no matter how hard they try. This is not about getting rich. It's about reaching the first point where clear thinking becomes possible. People assume that money changes life in large, dramatic jumps. They imagine a point where everything suddenly becomes easy. That belief keeps them confused. Real change happens earlier, and it happens quietly. Most amounts of money do nothing at all. A few $100s disappears. A few $1,000s creates relief and then vanishes. It solves immediate discomfort but changes no behavior. You're still operating under the same constraints, making the same kinds of decisions, just with slightly less urgency for a short time. The first threshold that matters is not about comfort, it's about structure. Before you reach it, your financial life is fragile. Small problems create large consequences. A missed paycheck, an unexpected expense, a bad decision. Each one threatens stability. In that environment, thinking becomes reactive by necessity. You're not choosing between good options. You're choosing between tolerable losses. That's not a moral failing. It's a structural one. When every error is costly, you cannot afford to think long term. You optimize for survival. You grab what's available. You sacrifice durability for speed. Over time, that mode of operation becomes normal. People begin to confuse urgency with importance. Around a modest threshold, something changes, not because the amount is impressive, but because fragility decreases. For the first time, mistakes no longer cascade immediately into crisis. There's a buffer, thin, but real. This is the point where decision-making begins to resemble rational thought instead of emergency management. With a small reserve, you gain separation between action and consequence. That separation is critical. It allows you to evaluate choices instead of reacting to them. It allows you to delay gratification without fear. It allows you to say no when the terms are unfavorable. This is why the first meaningful amount matters more than many larger ones. It alters the environment in which your mind operates. People often misunderstand this and focus on what the money can buy. That's the wrong question. The value is not in consumption, it's in insulation. Insulation from panic, insulation from desperation, insulation from bad incentives. Before this threshold, you are easily manipulated. You accept poor terms because you need immediate relief. You take on unnecessary risk because you cannot afford to wait. You trade long-term damage for short-term comfort and tell yourself you'll fix it later. Later rarely comes. Once you pass this point, even slightly, the power dynamic shifts. You are no longer forced to accept the first option available. You can walk away. You can pause. You can think. That ability compounds faster than money itself. Most people never reach this stage because they leak resources before they build stability. They upgrade their lifestyle the moment pressure eases. They treat temporary relief as permanent progress. As a result, they remain structurally fragile despite earning more. The irony is that this threshold is easier to reach than people think and harder to hold than they expect. It doesn't require brilliance. It requires restraint. It requires understanding that the purpose of this money is not enjoyment. It's leverage over your own behavior. If you use it to feel successful, it's gone. If you use it to reduce fragility, it changes everything that follows. This is the first point where wealth stops being theoretical and starts being functional. Not because the number is large, but because the consequences of your decisions finally slow down enough for judgment to matter. That's why this threshold matters, and why what you do immediately after reaching it determines whether it becomes a foundation or a brief illusion. Reaching $20,000 is the point where optionality, the real freedom to choose, emerges for the first time in a meaningful way. Before this threshold, every financial move is reactive. Buying groceries, paying rent, or covering an unexpected car repair forces immediate trade-offs. One missed paycheck can cascade into skipped bills, late fees, and stress-driven mistakes. At $5,000 or $10,000, there is some cushion, but it is fragile. Every dollar is still committed before it even exists. Once a person crosses roughly $20,000 in accessible liquid savings, the calculus changes. Emergencies no longer dictate behavior. Consider a $500 medical bill. With $5,000 saved, it consumes 10% of net liquidity, enough to force choices. Skip a bill, borrow, or sell something. At $20,000, the same $500 represents 2.5% of liquid resources. Suddenly, the expense is manageable. The mental weight of every dollar matters diminishes, and decision-making is freed from constant defensive accounting. Optionality is the difference between reacting and planning. Optionality is measurable in practical terms. With $20,000, one could survive a year of small living expenses, say $1,500 per month, without income. That buffer creates leverage. Take two identical job opportunities. One pays slightly more but demands strict hours. Another slightly less but allows skill development or networking. Before $20,000, the first option dominates because survival depends on immediate cash. After $20,000, the second can be chosen for its long-term payoff. Optionality transforms calculation from I have to do X to survive to I can afford to do X for growth. Optionality also compounds quietly. Each small advantage allows experimentation that would otherwise be impossible. For example, $2,000 can be invested in a short-term course or tool that improves skills. With $20,000, multiple experiments can run simultaneously. A minor investment in education, a side project funded, a small emergency travel fund. None of these would be feasible at lower levels. Each small bet carries asymmetric upside. Risk no longer threatens ruin because there is enough reserve to absorb failure. Optionality amplifies the effect of incremental decisions over time. Behaviorally, optionality changes incentives subtly but profoundly. People begin to think in terms of possibilities rather than constraints. They can negotiate more effectively, refuse exploitative work, or pursue opportunities that have delayed payoff. A $1,000 opportunity that costs a month of effort may have seemed impossible before. With $20,000, it becomes viable, and the mental freedom it produces reshapes priorities. This is why optionality is more valuable than any immediate return at this stage. It converts a stagnant state into a dynamic field of potential. Optionality also intersects with survivability. Before $20,000, most risks are existential. Losing a job, unexpected expenses, or health costs force immediate trade-offs. After this threshold, risk becomes calculable. People can test ventures, learn new skills, or negotiate without fearing that a single misstep will erase all progress. The mathematics are simple. Even a small reserve absorbs shocks, turning probabilistic risk into manageable variance. This is why the first meaningful money is about options, not status, luxury, or comfort. Finally, optionality reinforces itself. Each successful choice funded by this buffer expands confidence, creates networks, or generates small financial gains. A person with $20,000 can take calculated professional risks that someone with $5,000 cannot. This creates a feedback loop. Optionality allows better decisions increase resources, and more resources expand optionality. This loop is the first inflection point in the wealth behavior relationship, and it starts precisely at the level where money stops being a constant constraint around $20,000. Crossing the $20,000 threshold doesn't just give optionality, it quietly stretches the horizon over which decisions can be made. Poverty imposes an invisible deadline on every choice. When living paycheck to paycheck, every action is measured in days, sometimes hours. Missing a utility payment or running out of gas forces immediate consequences. Financial scarcity compresses thinking into the present. Every decision is defensive because failure is catastrophic. At $20,000 in liquid assets, the constraints ease. Consider this practically. If monthly expenses are $1,500, that reserve covers roughly 13 months. Suddenly, choices no longer demand instant survival calculations. A 3-month delay in pursuing a new client, investing in skill development, or switching jobs is no longer existential. Decisions that were previously judged only by immediate cash impact can now be evaluated for long-term benefit. Time becomes an asset as tangible as money itself. The extended horizon changes behavior first, outcomes later. People can now plan for growth without fear of collapse. Before this point, a $500 investment in learning a new tool or side project might seem reckless. It's a fifth of a month's income, too risky. With $20,000, it represents 2.5% of the buffer. The same action carries manageable risk, allowing experimentation. By giving people the ability to think in months rather than days, financial slack transforms strategy into choice. Time horizon extension also alters incentives. Immediate gratification loses dominance. For example, skipping a night out or small impulse purchase used to be critical to cover rent or groceries. Now, the same money can be evaluated for longer-term gain, investing in knowledge, building a portfolio, or testing a small business idea. Decisions are no longer reactive, they become strategic. This shift may be invisible at first, but it compounds over months. Even modest delayed rewards start to matter because there is room to wait, learn, and adjust. Another measurable effect is career decision making. With only $5,000 in savings, leaving a job for a slightly better opportunity is dangerous. Any delay in income can trigger financial instability. At $20,000, a person has roughly 4 months cushion if income is paused, giving the freedom to negotiate, switch roles, or invest in skills without immediate collapse. The horizon stretches from weekly survival to quarterly and yearly planning. This temporal buffer converts risk from fatal to calculable. Finally, the psychological shift is profound. Stress decreases, attention improves, and mental bandwidth expands. Decisions that were previously clouded by fear become analyzable. People start tracking probabilities, weighing costs versus benefits, and considering long-term consequences for the first time. The $20,000 threshold doesn't buy wisdom, but it buys the ability to act wisely. It quiets the tyranny of the short term and allows strategy to replace instinctive defense. Time, once compressed by scarcity, becomes an ally. With it comes patience, reflection, and the ability to iterate. Financial buffers of this scale are not about luxury. They are about extending the temporal window in which thoughtful, calculated decisions can occur. Outcomes lag behind behavior, but by the time results are visible, the advantage of a longer horizon has already compounded silently, laying the foundation for sustainable growth. Reaching $20,000 doesn't instantly make life better, but it quietly changes behavior in measurable ways. This threshold acts like a magnifying glass. It doesn't create new abilities. It amplifies what was already present. The surprising fact is that behavior shifts before any noticeable financial outcomes. People begin acting differently without yet seeing more money, higher returns, or improved opportunities. Consider daily spending patterns. Before $20,000, nearly every purchase is constrained. Even small discretionary expenses, $50 for groceries beyond the minimum, $30 for transportation alternatives, or $20 for minor tools or materials, are scrutinized. Once the buffer exists, those same amounts can be spent strategically rather than reactively. A $50 online course that previously seemed reckless now becomes a calculated investment in skill development. A $100 software upgrade is no longer a burden, but a tool that compounds advantage. Behavior changes because choices can now align with long-term priorities instead of immediate survival. Decision-making also evolves in measurable, number-driven ways. Negotiations improve when desperation recedes. For instance, someone negotiating a contract for $3,000 of work with a $20,000 cushion can afford to reject unfavorable terms. Previously, the same negotiation might have been accepted under duress, losing value, or imposing hidden costs. The difference is purely behavioral. The money allows people to act according to rational assessment, not urgency. Risk management improves before outcomes reflect it. A person with $20,000 can tolerate calculated failures. Investing $500 in a test project or experimenting with a new revenue stream doesn't threaten survival. Before this, identical choices could destroy liquidity and create cascading stress. Optional bets are no longer fatal, so individuals behave more entrepreneurially, exploring asymmetrical gains rather than clinging to purely defensive positions. Even routine habits shift subtly. Time allocation becomes more strategic. With immediate pressure relieved, energy can be invested in planning, learning, and networking. Someone with $5,000 may have spent 90% of their mental bandwidth managing current obligations. At $20,000, they suddenly devote 30-40% of that bandwidth to growth-oriented tasks. The cumulative effect is profound over months. Better habits, more deliberate focus, and higher quality choices emerge well before any noticeable financial improvement. Behavioral reinforcement occurs through small, measurable actions: paying bills early, negotiating deals, investing in tools, or dedicating time to skill acquisition are all behaviors made feasible by the buffer. These behaviors compound silently, often unnoticed, creating an invisible lead-in advantage. Outcomes, higher income, successful side ventures, or accelerated career growth come later, but they almost always reflect the behavioral shift that began at the $20,000 threshold. The key insight: $20,000 doesn't buy happiness, luxury, or status. It buys clarity, choice, and the ability to act consistently with long-term interests. The first meaningful money changes what people do, not what they are. It reveals potential through action, aligning everyday decisions with strategy rather than survival. Outcomes lag, but behavior leads, and those who understand this often capitalize on it before anyone else notices. At $20,000, the concept of risk begins to shift, but the first rule is simple: play it safe. Before this point, even small bets are dangerous. Failure has disproportionate consequences. Every decision carries potential ruin. After crossing the threshold, risk becomes calculable, but only if approached strategically. The immediate impulse to invest, spend, or make drastic moves must be tempered by deliberate planning. Saving aggressively remains the most effective strategy. Treat the first $20,000 as a buffer, not a springboard. Every extra $1,000 adds optionality and time to act. For example, if living expenses are $1,500 per month, each $1,500 in savings buys one more month of freedom. A $25,000 reserve allows 16 months. $30,000 gives 20 months. The advantage is simple: the larger the buffer, the more flexibility to wait for the right opportunity, the less pressure to compromise in negotiations, and the lower the cost of failure. Risk without a margin for error is not risk, it is exposure to catastrophe. Planning becomes essential. A common error at this stage is jumping too early into investments, career changes, or relocation. Suppose someone considers a side business requiring $5,000 to launch, or moving to a city with higher earning potential but higher cost of living. If they do this with $20,000, they may survive short term, but any unexpected expenses, medical bills, car repairs, or temporary unemployment could erase the advantage. Waiting until the reserve reaches $30,000 or $40,000 converts these moves from speculative gambles into calculated actions. At that point, survivability is high and risk is manageable. Practical planning also means sequencing. First, secure liquidity. Prioritize building a reserve that covers at least a year of essential expenses. Track monthly cash flow precisely. Every $100 saved increases the number of safe months. Second, identify opportunities and calculate costs, both immediate and hidden. Third, act only once the buffer is sufficient to absorb errors. This is why crossing $20,000 is not an invitation to spend or invest immediately. It is a signal that risk can now be measured, not ignored. Investments should be considered after safety is secured. Start with low-cost, low-risk opportunities: index funds, skill development, or small experiments that do not threaten the primary reserve. Avoid high-leverage moves or speculative projects that could consume a meaningful portion of liquidity. Even a seemingly minor $2,000 mistake is 10% of a $20,000 reserve, but only 5% of a $40,000 reserve. Calculable risk depends on relative scale, not absolute numbers. Finally, timing matters. Moving cities, starting businesses, or negotiating career leaps should wait until both financial and mental readiness align. The first $20,000 buys optionality. The next $20,000 buys the freedom to act decisively. Playing it safe, saving rigorously, and planning carefully transforms the first meaningful sum into a launching pad rather than a precarious step. Risk becomes calculable when survivability exists, and until then, preservation is strategy. Now, you should be very careful when you have capital. Crossing $20,000 gives optionality, a longer horizon, and the ability to take calculated risks. Yet, most people lose this advantage because of predictable behavioral mistakes. The first trap is lifestyle expansion. A sudden buffer tempts immediate spending. Upgrading living arrangements, buying gadgets, or indulging in conveniences that previously seemed unattainable. Spending $500 monthly on non-essential expenses might feel small, but over a year, it consumes $6,000, 30% of the first meaningful reserve. Many treat the buffer as income rather than protection, eroding optionality and turning freedom back into constraint. The second trap is activity without thought. With $20,000, people often assume they can afford to be busy or take actions without planning. They sign up for side projects, try investments, or pursue opportunities without analyzing costs, risk, or timing. A $1,000 test project seems negligible. But if 5 such experiments occur simultaneously, $5,000, 25% of the reserve is committed with little strategy. The result is superficial activity that consumes energy and money, leaving the individual no safer than when they had $5,000. Optionality demands intentional action, not mere busyness. The final trap is returning to fragility voluntarily. People who fail to maintain discipline often undermine their own progress. Moving to a higher cost city before building an adequate reserve, taking on debt for non-essential consumption, or over-leveraging opportunities all erode the safety margin. Consider someone with $25,000 who spends $10,000 on lifestyle upgrades and invests another $5,000 in high-risk ventures without proper planning. Their $20,000 advantage disappears, leaving them more fragile than before. The buffer that created clarity and freedom is gone, and the person is once again governed by scarcity. The warning is clear. Crossing $20,000 is not a license to spend or experiment recklessly. The first meaningful sum is fragile. It buys optionality, not immunity. Every financial choice must be measured against the potential to preserve and grow the buffer. The real advantage comes from restraint, strategic allocation, and patience. Ignoring these principles leads to rapid erosion of freedom, often faster than anyone realizes. Behavioral patterns reinforce this loss. Human nature favors immediate gratification and visible gains over long-term planning. Without conscious control, lifestyle creep, impulsive activity, and premature exposure to risk combine to dismantle the very edge $20,000 provides. The numbers illustrate the danger. A single year of careless spending or misjudged projects can consume 25-50% of the buffer. And once optionality is gone, recovery is slow, stressful, and psychologically draining. Preserving the advantage requires deliberate awareness, consistent saving, and disciplined action. Treat the buffer as sacred. Measure every commitment against its impact on optionality, and resist lifestyle inflation until the next threshold of stability is reached. Most people fail because they forget that money is a tool for freedom and clarity, not a target to display or exhaust. The $20,000 mark is the first true inflection point in behavior, but without vigilance, it can also be the point where freedom is lost voluntarily, one decision at a time.